My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this, the second public dialogue of Georgetown's new initiative on Catholic social thought and public life. The title of the dialogue, The Pope and the Poor, Challenges of Pope Francis and Catholic Social Thought for American Poverty. Now, about a year ago, when President DeGioia began speaking with John Carr and his colleagues about standing up this initiative here at Georgetown, we knew that Catholic social teaching was a critical topic for interdisciplinary teaching and research, that it was relevant to the problems facing this country, facing the United States, and that it provided a valuable lens on pressing global economic, social, and political challenges. This was all just before Francis became Pope. John, you've got a great sense of timing. In less than 9 months now, it's incredible to reflect. In less than 9 months, Francis has elevated Catholic social teaching to new prominence, challenging the Church, challenging everyone around the world to address face-on persistent problems of poverty and inequality, and to break with what he has called in one of many powerful phrases, break with the globalization of indifference. Given Francis's galvanizing impact on the Church and the world, it is fitting that our first two public dialogues in September and again today are addressing his ideas, his actions, and their implications for our national and for our global community. And I think you'll agree that there's no one more qualified to introduce John, our distinguished panel, and tonight's topic than Cardinal McCarrick. Cardinal McCarrick, known to all of us as a great servant of the Church and a great friend to Georgetown. A native New Yorker, he served as Archbishop of Newark before becoming Archbishop here in Washington from 2001 to 2006. He's had a long and distinguished career, just a couple of highlights. He served as Chancellor of the Catholic University of America and as Chair of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration, as well as Chair of its committees on international policy and domestic policy. Among many accolades, Cardinal McCarrick received the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award from President Clinton, and in 1999, from 1999 to 2001, he served as a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. A global pastor, an advocate of social justice, an advisor to presidents and popes, Cardinal McCarrick is one of our great bridge builders and peacemakers. Just a few days ago, for example, he returned from a trip to the Philippines, which he visited in the aftermath of the typhoon on behalf of Catholic Relief Services. Your Eminence, it is fitting that you should lead off the discussion tonight of the Pope and the poor, given the character of your ministry and your role as the leader of the core group that developed the idea for the initiative that has brought us here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Cardinal McCarrick.
One of my nephews is here, so he was doing most of the clapping. So I always try to bring someone from the family because otherwise there can be a lot of silence after the introduction. Tom, thank you very much. That's a very warm and gracious introduction. I really appreciate your kind words, your friendship, and your extraordinary service to this university, to the Church, and to this very important initiative that you have helped to launch. When from the very first moment, and President DeGioia, who's been a dear friend of ours, welcomed us to Georgetown, it was Dr. Tom who had been our ally and advocate in helping this initiative get off to a tremendous start. And we could not, I think it's safe to say, could not have done it without you. So you're the granduncle, the grandfather. You're too young to be the grandfather. You're the whatever, the great patron of the initiative. So thank you so very, very much. When John Carr and several of us, including a number of leaders here tonight, began to explore this idea, we obviously had no idea that our efforts would be blessed by the remarkable leadership and example of our present Holy Father. Pope Francis is offering a unique moment and tremendous momentum for our efforts to share the wisdom of Catholic social teaching and to reach out to the next generation of Catholic leaders. That is basically, in a nutshell, the core of everything that John Carr is doing for us. He is trying to share the wisdom that he has practiced, that he has understood, that he has preached for so many years to the bishops of the United States and to everyone in our country, in so many talks and so many papers and so many discourses and in so many examples of and really extraordinary Catholic life for all his years. And he has really been the man of the moment, and the moment is the moment that Pope Francis has given us all. This work of the initiative is crucial and timely, essential for our church, important for our country, and vital for this university. It is directed by this uniquely qualified and skilled leader. John Carr and I have worked together for many, many years, and there's no one more respected and trusted for his knowledge, balance, and skills in shaping and applying Catholic social teaching. Over 25 years, he served our Bishops' Conference so well, but this, we believe, may be the most important work of his life. And because there are so many wonderful things he's done, this is a great thing to say about this initiative, because if this is the great work of his life, then certainly we rejoice that he does it for us and with us, and that we are able to participate in these early and wonderful days of its foundation. The work is crucial and timely. It's essential for our church. It's important for our country and for all of us Catholics and for non-Catholics. I'm proud to be a small part of the initiative. I'm convinced that it's the right mission, as Shep Abel said, at the right place with the right leadership at the right time. This is evident in the tremendous response to the initiative, demonstrated by the remarkable attendance and spirit of the first dialogue and by the impressive turnout tonight. Who would have thought, John always says this, who would have thought a year ago we could gather so many, especially students at Georgetown, on the Monday after the Thanksgiving break for a discussion on the Pope and the poor? Thank you for coming, and thank you for your support of this very important initiative. I've been asked to offer some reflections on the topic of the Pope and the poor. I was preparing this when last Wednesday we received the Holy Father's powerful exhortation on the joy of the gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. This is a wide-ranging reflection, insisting that the gospel is good news, and we ought to act like it's good news. It places care for and commitment to the poor and the vulnerable at the very center of the Church's evangelizing mission and of all Catholic life. Pope Francis is not ashamed to say he wants a church which is poor and for the poor. In this exhortation, Pope Francis sets aside the agenda and casts and charts a path forward for tonight's discussion and for the Church's continuing solidarity with those who are poor and vulnerable. The Holy Father, in writing this encyclical, has put in not just words, but also his life. It's his heart's in here. This will be one of the great documents of his papacy, as so many of the Holy Fathers are remembered for one special document or one special thing. Many of us think, although this is a young pontificate, and this Pope will do many wonderful things in the future years, but many of us think that this is going to be one of the centerpieces of his preaching and of his doctrine. From the moment of his election, in his choice of the name Francis, in what he says and what he does, the Holy Father places solidarity with the poor and the vulnerable at the heart of his leadership. In his visit to Lampedusa, the Isle of Tears for so many migrants there in the Mediterranean, to the favelas of Rio, to Assisi, and to his stunning everyday outreach to the disabled and the disfigured, Francis shows us the way. He mirrors Jesus in his compassion. He exemplifies what the church preaches about priority for the poor and the imperative justice. He doesn't just reach out to the poor, is this a great mob, a great measure of people, but to individuals who are poor, brothers and sisters, touching them and loving them as children of God and members of our one Christian family. And he doesn't fit into a category, this Holy Father. He's a category of his own. He's a prophet who sees the world as it is and has the courage to make it better. His exhortation is lengthy. Maybe some of you have read part of it, or even some of you have read all of it. I would recommend that you read it all because it will surprise you. Turn the page and there's another thought, another deep challenge, another realization of what we've always known but have never seen it in writing. Read it. Be familiar with it. If you're a Catholic, it will be your declaration of who you are. It will be your guiding passbook. It will be your challenge and your joy that the shepherd of the church thinks this way, loves this way, and cares so much about us this way. It's lengthy, it's wide-ranging, it's weaving together scripture, Catholic teaching, reason. It covers how to preach a homily. You'll be happy to know he encourages us to be short. It warns against pessimism and polarization. It talks of the roles of women and the conversion of the papacy in our church. Read it. Resist the temptation to try to fit Pope Francis into our own ideological and ecclesial preferences and prejudices. He affirms and challenges all of us. The Pope speaks simply, warning against Christians becoming, and his language is there, disillusioned pessimists and sourpusses. I have never heard that in a papal document. He cautions us of becoming mummies in a museum. And he also offers us more abstract warnings to show us that as a Jesuit he was well educated. Warnings against Gnosticism and especially against self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagianism. I leave it to the panelists who come after me to explain what he means by that. Francis builds on and extends the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, the teaching of his predecessors, John the 23rd, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict the 16th. It was Blessed John Paul who outlined the advantages and limitations of markets and the need for moral framework to guide their work. It was Benedict who said concern for the poor was one of the three essentials that God has given us: the faith, the sacraments, and the need to care for the poor. Along with proclaiming the gospel and celebrating the sacraments, the need to take care of the poor, the need for charity in our lives as Catholics, as Christians, is so essential in making us truly who we are supposed to be. What is different from his predecessors may be the passion that we see in Pope Francis, shaped in his work in the slums of Buenos Aires, or his simple language and contemporary references to trickle-down economics or the idolatry of money, or the frankness of openness to the secular media that have come in so many great numbers to listen to this Pope and to try to understand him. I told a story upstairs, and I know I have like 3 minutes to speak. Well, maybe 30. No, but really only 3. I promise you, only 3. But I went down to, I was visiting him once in Buenos Aires, because we're classmates in the sense that we were both made cardinals together. So you get to know the fellows you've made cardinals with. I landed in the airport of Buenos Aires, got through the thing, got my bags. As soon as I opened the door, he was there to meet me. Took my bags I said, please, I took my bags, went to a car, didn't have his own car. He borrowed a car from somebody, borrowed the driver, borrowed the owner too, and he said he'll drive us home. And on the way home, we passed through all the historic places of Buenos Aires. The Casa Rosada, their White House, the Houses of Parliament, the government places, the great museums, the great statues, all these wonderful things. Did I hear about it from Cardinal Bergoglio? No. The only thing I heard about, he said, under this bridge is the worst slum in Buenos Aires. I try to go there as often as I can. The people are so poor. And then in a little while, over there, see on that hill, that's another terrible area. There's crime there, there's drugs there. We've got to clean it up somehow. And so my whole visit was a visit not of the historic or cultural wonders of this extraordinary city, but more of the needs that Christians have to do something there, to build something there, to correct something there, to bring happiness and right and joy to the people who live there. This was the man that we all got to know, and that the world is getting to know now so well. In his exhortation, Francis defends religious freedom, the rights of the church to live with integrity in a pluralistic society. He also defends the sacredness of marriage and the stability of the family, as is necessary for society to survive. He lifts up the rights and dignity of migrants and victims of human trafficking. He is crystal clear about the humanity of unborn children. He says, the most defenseless and innocent among us are these. Nowadays, efforts are made to deny them their human dignity, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this. It is not progressive to try to solve problems by eliminating a human life, Pope Francis insists. In setting the framework for our discussion on the Pope and the poor, I offer the Holy Father's own words on the challenges we face in terms of our own personality and personal responsibility. Francis could not be more clear, quote, each individual Christian in every community is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and the promotion of the poor, and for enabling them to be fully a part of society. He calls every one of us to work to help to eliminate the structural causes of poverty and to promote the integral development of the poor, as well as small daily acts of solidarity in meeting the real needs which we encounter. He is not the one who says, change the whole society immediately. He says, change the whole society, but take care of the man who's trying to sleep on the grate. Take care of the lady who is wearing towels and bed sheets instead of a dress. He singles out those of us in ecclesial and academic life, insisting that there's no excuse for indifference or inaction. He says, no one must say they cannot be close to the poor because of their own lifestyle demands more attention to other areas. This is an excuse commonly heard in academic, business, or professional, and even in ecclesiastical circles. None of us can think we are exempt from concern for the poor and for social justice. Our commitment does not consist exclusively in activities or programs of promotion and assistance, but above all, a loving attentiveness which entails appreciating the poor in their goodness, in their experience of life, in their culture, in their ways of living the faith, and right in their face, where he hugs and kisses the poor, the malformed, the sick, According to Francis, we have a duty to defend the rights and dignity of those who are poor, but also to love them, to listen to them, and to treat them as members of our family. Francis warns that the worst discrimination the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God. This redefines in special ways that great need that we know of the church's priority to take care of the poor. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate into a privileged and preferential religious core. And then he says so beautifully toward the end, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. A church in the streets. In some other writing, he's called it a field hospital for the hurting, a source of mercy and hope, which will confront an economic status quo where the majority of our contemporaries are barely living from aid from day to day. Pope Francis is blunt and direct. Just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today, we also have to say thou shalt not to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? This is a case in today. Everything comes under law of competition and survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed on the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized without work, without possibility, without any means of escape. Pope Francis insisted, while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity exercised and enjoyed by the happy few. The imbalance is the result of ideologies which define the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the rights of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. To all this, we can add widespread corruption and self-serving tax evasion, which happens in so many countries. He calls us to look out for each other, and especially to look out for those who are in need. When he talks about his policy goals, he says we're not simply talking about ensuring nourishment or a dignified sustenance for all people, but also their general temporal welfare and prosperity. This means education, access to health care, and above all, employment, for it is through free, creative, participatory, and mutually supported labor and that human beings express and enhance the dignity of their lives. A just wage enables them to have adequate access to all the other goods which are destined for our common good. Talking about political things, the Holy Father seems to be quoting from the U.S. Bishop's article on faithful citizenship, which our John Carr had so much to do in phrasing the right way and in getting it through the Conference of Bishops. He says, people in every nation enhance the social dimension of their lives by acting as committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by the powers that be. Let us not forget that responsible citizenship is a virtue, and participation in political life is a moral obligation. As he comes to the close, and as I come to mine, Pope Francis asks, ask God to give us more politicians capable of sincere and effective dialogue aimed at healing the deepest roots and not simply the appearances of evils in the world. Politics, though often denigrated, remains a lofty vocation and one of the highest forms of charity. I beg the Lord, he says, to grant us more politicians who are genuinely disturbed by the state of society, by the people, the lives of the poor. It is vital that government leaders and financial leaders take heed and broaden their horizons, working to ensure that all citizens have dignified work, education, and health care. The Holy Father speaks long and well about all these things. I can read it to you, but it's my hope that you'll read it yourself, because really it's worth a read, worth a study, and even worth the pattern of a lifetime. An authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, always involves a deep desire to change the world, the Holy Father says, to transmit values, to leave the earth somehow better than we found it. If indeed the just ordering of society and the state is the central responsibility of politics, the Church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. And, dear friends, if you listen to the Holy Father, neither can we. I'm happy now to present a man who has lived these doctrines, lived these commands, lived them well, with enthusiasm, with joy, with courage, and with wisdom. The director of this important initiative, John Carr.
There are members of my family here, and they want equal time to talk about my service. Cardinal McCarrick has given us a masterful summary of this document. In Washington, we have this bad habit of what's called the Washington Read, where you never even buy the book. You go in the store and you check the index and you only read those pages that apply to you. Well, Cardinal McCarrick has given us a masterful Washington Read of the Pope and the poor. And I was going to add lots of very eloquent ideas to that, and I'm not going to. I mean, he's done it. The one thing I would say, the Cardinal said lots of nice things about me. We got to know each other during a lot of very boring meetings and a lot of very exciting trips. One of the great advantages of working for the Bishops' Conference is you see the vitality and the strength of our church, not only in this country, but around the world. And there is no one who has expressed the solidarity of the church in the United States with the church around the world better than Cardinal McCarrick, even now in his 80s. And this is not always fun. I once described these solidarity trips by bishops as a family vacation without the fun. Cardinal McCarrick's idea of a good time, if you have an extra hour, is add 2 more meetings. But I have seen this pastor at the White House and in a refugee camp, on the Hill and on the West Bank, make the case for the life and dignity of the human person in a church that is present every day in the lives, in the dignity, in the hearts of the poor. I said upstairs, we're all wondering what a Francis bishop might look like. I think we have one. Cardinal McCarrick was a Francis bishop before there was a Francis. And we are blessed to have had him as our pastor, and we're still blessed to have him as our leader in expressing the solidarity of the church. The initiative, which I was going to describe, I would urge you to take a look at the little program that's out there. He said it right. We're going to try and share the secret of Catholic social teaching more deeply, more broadly, more affirmatively, in ways that we hope will make a greater difference. And we're going to do that by reaching out to the next generation of Catholic leaders, here at Georgetown, but also here in Washington. Young people who got into public life with a sense of service, even a sense of faith, and who have been caught up in the ideological and political wars. And we want to remind them, as Francis is, that their faith is not a burden, but a tremendous asset as they live their lives. Some people have commented that we have a remarkable sense of timing with these presentations. We had our first session 3 or 4 days after the America article, and we have this session 4 or 5 days after his first apostolic exhortation. He actually seems to be the best advanced person I've ever seen for an event like this. And what he has done is provided a forum, an agenda, a path that we're going to explore with our panelists. I would ask them to take their place on the stage as I introduce them. Come on up, gang. I have some wonderful things to say about you, but I need to find them. I also have some other things to say, but I won't. Bishop Blaire is the Bishop of Stockton, California. He was elected by his brother bishops to be their leader in the area of domestic policy and economic justice. He has been the point person of the bishops in carrying forward this agenda on healthcare, on poverty, on civil rights, on budget policies. He has been the leader of the Circle of Protection. He is a bishop who is close to his people, as Francis has said, and has lifted high the standard of our Catholic social thought. E.J. Dionne and Michael Gerson are columnists at the Washington Post. Frankly, they're an example of the kind of civil dialogue we rarely have in Washington. They come from different places. E.J. is a Democrat. Michael is a Republican. E.J. actually says he's a liberal. Not many people say that anymore. Michael is a proud conservative. I think the foremost articulator of compassionate conservatism. E.J. is introduced here as Georgetown as a distinguished professor. I've learned that's very important. You are a distinguished professor here at Georgetown. But he also is a leader at the Brookings Institute and a columnist and appears on TV. He writes really smart books with really nice titles, like Why Americans Hate Politics. That sounds like fun. And Our Divided Political Heart. But his books talk about division, but E.J. is a uniter. He builds bridges. Michael Gerson is best known for his leadership in the White House, where he was President Bush's speechwriter and advisor. He's now affiliated with a number of organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, with U.S. News and World Report. He has also written books about faith and politics. The thing I remember about Michael is, as we look at Africa, in many ways, the most remarkable legacy of the Bush administration is the investment that was made in HIV/AIDS, in malaria, in development assistance, and the conscience clauses that made that possible. The leadership goes to the president, the leadership goes to the Congress, but the work was done by Michael and his colleagues, and millions of people are alive because of that work. Kathryn Lopez is a writer, an editor-at-large at National Review Online. She's appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the Human Life Review, First Things. She's on a lot of the shows we watch. She writes and works in Catholic media. She's a graduate of Catholic University. The thing that most impressed me about Kathryn, two things. One, she helped start Catholic Voices, which was an effort like ours to help lay people take up the task of articulating and acting on Catholic teaching in public life. And secondly, I've been reading her since Pope Francis was elected. And it'd be fair to say that EJ is more enthusiastic than some others, maybe on the right. And Kathryn has been a voice that has said, let's not look at our Holy Father through ideological or political lenses. Let's take a step back and listen and watch and see him as a preacher of the gospel and as a proclaimer of Jesus' life and words for us. And I think that's good advice, not just on the right or on the left, but for all of us. I think that's what Cardinal McCarrick asked us to do. Read it. Don't try and fit it into our own prejudices. So let me begin with a general question, and I'd ask Bishop Blaire to start here. In light of what we've experienced these last 9 months, as Cardinal McCarrick said, where he's been, what he said, and now this incredible wide-ranging apostolic exhortation, what is the most compelling message you have heard from our Holy Father on the question of poverty, on economic justice, on our solidarity with the poor? And I would ask Bishop Blaire and then Kathryn and then EJ, followed by Michael, to take a stab at that. So what, in light of all we have seen and heard, what is most compelling to you as we take up this question of poverty, which frankly is so ignored in our national discourse right now? Bishop Blaire.
Well, thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this initiative tonight. Before I answer your question, I would like to share that I had a Francis experience this afternoon. I was at Union Station waiting to be picked up, and I had my collar on, and I was definitely smelling the sheep as they came up. And it was really interesting talking to these people. So many of them reflected the very issues that the Holy Father has in his document. One man was homeless, another one was unemployed, another one was on drugs, and all of that experienced in a few minutes. And I thought, golly, what I had been reading in the document today, it's very, very real. I think to answer your question requires a preliminary comment. I don't think there really is anything new in what Pope Francis is saying about the poor. It's always been part of the Church's teaching. It certainly has been part and parcel of the Catholic social teaching of the Church in these over last 100 years. But there's something new. And I was trying to think, what is it? And number one is, I think that Pope Francis is speaking the gospel in a common language that we can understand. And this is very, very biblical because the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. And Koine Greek was the spoken language of the people. I remember studying classical Greek and how difficult it was, Xenophon's and Abbas's. Then when we started reading John's Gospel in Koine Greek, it was so easy to read. And I think that's what Francis is doing. He's speaking in a way that we can understand, and he's using modern methods, interviews, daily homilies, and he's speaking as a believer. I've never seen this before in any papal documents where he speaks about his own personal feelings. He said, "It always pains me greatly to see division." Or he says, we all have to be missionary disciples. So what are we waiting for? So these are really down-to-earth human ways of speaking the gospel. Secondly, I think what is impressive is that he is speaking as a pastor who has been on the streets with his people in Buenos Aires. We heard that tonight. In their homes, where people are hurting, where people are in need, with the smelly sheep. And thirdly, he speaks as a pastor who has lived with a simplicity in his own life. He didn't just start doing this after he was elected Pope. All these points, I think, give us a freshness and a new authenticity to his message. Now, what has really struck me, before he ever spoke about poverty, he speaks about the gospel. He speaks about the fact that the gospel is God's great love for us, expressed in his mercy and compassion by sending his own Son, who calls us to conversion on a way of life by personally encountering Jesus Christ. That's all through this exhortation. And once you personally encounter Christ, then he says, here are two important points. Number one, boldly then take the initiative. Go out to others, seek those who have fallen away, stand at the crossroads, and welcome the outcast. And secondly, embracing human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ in others. That leads us to the poor. And he sees the poor as the privileged recipients of the gospel. But here's the zinger in the whole document, if I may say, from my opinion. He quotes in paragraph 57, St. John Chrysostom. This is what St. John said. Not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and to take away their livelihood. It is not our own goods which we hold, but theirs. Wow. That raises enormous questions about private property versus the dominion of God over all creation and our stewardship of the earth's goods and the universal destination of goods. We have an enormous amount there to think about.
Thanks
So
very much.
That would be
Kathryn, what was the zinger for you?
Well,
well, the zinger for me was that
I'm asking Kathryn to respond. You picked your zinger.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's all right. I'm asking her for a zinger.
Thank you.
well,
You had a good one, though.
to go back to the Washington Reads, Michael and I were talking about this earlier. The poverty of Washington is that someone does a write-up, and we all talk about the write-up. So most of the people commenting on the comments about the document, of course, haven't read it. But when you read it, I just have to briefly echo so much of what Bishop Blaire and Cardinal McCarrick said. There's so much richness to it. And to rewind just very briefly to about a year ago, there was a conference in Rome on ecclesia in America, and there were church leaders from the Americas there, some lay people. I was one of the lay people. And at the time, Pope Benedict, I was sort of taken aback. I had just landed, and the Pope seemed to be yelling at us, reprimanding us for being, quote, Catholic leaders who aren't necessarily living sacramental lives. This now, when you look back and you look at everything that has come since then, it reads even more as a reprimand, frankly, because the fact of the matter is Catholics all too often do not show lives that are different, radically different, conform to the gospel, conform with encounter with Christ. Pope Benedict was talking about encounter with Christ around there. then all of a sudden, this new thing comes on the scene, and I thought we saw the first picture. I mean, Pope John Paul and others have obviously talked about their prayer life, but when Pope Benedict started talking about started giving us this window into prayer life and a pope's prayer life, and the fact that he obviously prays to the Holy Spirit and seeks to encounter and lives this Trinitarian life, right? Which we're supposed to be living. So when Pope Francis comes on the scene, I remember I was over in Rome for the conclave, quote, covering the conclave. Of course, you can't actually cover the conclave. You go to lunch and speculate about what they possibly could be talking about. But when I remember, there's so many things to talk about that, but I won't right now. But the Sunday Angelus, the first Sunday Angelus, I don't speak Italian, so a friend of mine was translating in my ear, and I said to him, he's begging us. He's begging us to understand divine mercy. He's begging us to go to confession. And when you read the exhortation last week, and you read everything, frankly, Francis says or has written, so much of, after you read the exhortation or before, I don't care about the order, but please read both. The Paracita document that he helped put together when he was a bishop, he was Cardinal of Buenos Aires, the bishops of the Caribbean and Latin America. So much of this is there. Never, always joy. Never lose the joy of the evangelization. All the things now, if you go back and read the Paracita document, if you read the daily homilies, you sort of read the exhortation and think, oh, I wonder where the mercy line is going to come now. And so many of these things he repeats because, like any good communicator knows, you have to repeat things because people don't listen the first time or they can only hear so much. So when he talks about the globalization of indifference, when he talks about the fact that we can't be ignoring people in front of us, well, we do live lives where we are totally overwhelmed. And so this isn't autobiographical or anything. I mean, you go to daily mass and there are people in front of you who you don't have time for, right? You think you don't have time for. And no, that can't be. And if the Pope can even find time, you can take a little time off your text messages to actually encounter a human being. Oh, and how is that possible? Well, it's possible because you are actually encountering Christ. You're not just going to Sunday Mass, So I think with Francis, there's this remarkable. There's a little Ignatian walkthrough he's doing with us where he always talks about the devil. We don't hear about that in the media. It's all the joy stuff. But he talks about the devil, too, and the fact that there's good and evil in the world, and that you have to discern these things and live and examine life. And the other aspect of Francis that I just think is so important because it makes it all seem plausible, right? If you have a loving father who actually loves you and the poor guy on the street and, oh yeah, the rich man too, and is challenging us all. And he gave us his son and we have the Holy Spirit to guide us. It all seems to be possible. And as the Cardinal was saying, not necessarily have to change the world right now, just what's in front of you. And there's a lot of that to deal with, to begin with. Okay. So it really is a remarkable practical, as the bishop was saying, I think.
EJ, your zinger, or we sort of had a preview this morning in the paper, I thought. But is this Pope Francis' greatest hits, or is this something new?
Well, I think it's both. I think there's something old. The Catholic social thought goes back a long way. There's also something new. I just want to say I love a pope who takes a stand against sourpusses. And I actually think that's no accident. I mean, I think that infuses his whole ministry. I also have to say that he is the only pope who has ever made a moral case against political pundits. Indeed, he's made a case against appearing ever on a panel. I don't know if many of you remember. It's true, I had to search my conscience. In the American Review, some of you may remember, the Pope said, if one has the answers to all the questions, that is proof that God is not with that person. And so I don't think we can ever do any panels again under that.
You were in a lot of trouble. I promise you did.
But to humbly answer your question, John, I think there are a couple of key things that do make him different, because I don't think we should pretend that he is getting all this attention, he has created all this energy, he has become a cool pope. Can you imagine being that age and being cool? Only Cardinal McCarrick pulls that off. And the reason is there is something different here. I think there are three things. One is there is a radicalism and an urgency to what he is saying. And you read the language of this latest document in so many places. You know, he talks about a deified market. He talks about a system which tends to devour everything, which stands in the way of increased profits. He talks about defenseless beings. And so I think that we cannot deny that he has given a higher priority to the church's social teaching, to our obligations to the poor, and to criticism of an unjust economy than we have heard in a long time. Not that he is inconsistent with John Paul or Benedict, because they said some tough things about the market as well. But I think this is so central to who he is. The second thing is we've had this argument for a long time in the church and among Christians, and not just among Christians, in fact, about social sin and individual sin. And it seems to me he is bringing these two together. He's saying you have to acknowledge social sin if you care about individual sin, but you also have to care about individual sin. On Cyber Monday and in the wake of Black Friday, I was really struck with this line, which I think brings the two together about both our personal obligations, but also what may be wrong in the society. He wrote, "We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us." And so I think he is saying we must behave as individuals in a certain way toward the poor. They are part of us. But we also then have to turn to broader solutions. The last thing I want to say is I think everybody who listens to or reads Pope Francis needs to ask themselves, how would they react to some of these things if he were not the Pope? Because I can imagine an awful lot of people hearing an awful lot of these things. Rush Limbaugh comes to mind. I thought it was very instructive that Rush chose to take on the Pope, although he said, who wrote this for him? Rush couldn't believe that a pope would say such things, even though other popes have said such things. And I just think that that's part of our conscience. And since I'm the liberal here, or the one admitted liberal here, I just want to say that it is striking. He did reaffirm the church's teaching on abortion. And it was interesting that he followed that by saying two things. He said, it is also true that we have done little to adequately accompany women in very difficult situations. And I think that, too, was an interesting call to conscience. And then he immediately went to other defenseless beings who are frequently at the mercy of economic interests and indiscriminate exploitation. Dare I say it, this sounds like a seamless garment to me.
Michael, I don't think the condemnation of pundits applies to you since you're not a Catholic.
Right.
So
the
you're
church is
free.
always tougher on its own, we know that.
You're free to defend sourpusses or... how did this strike you as someone who is not Catholic but knows Catholic social thought probably better than most of us who say we are Catholic?
That's true.
Well, I've said in print that Pope Francis is a troublemaker. He actually enjoys provoking a little bit. And it's an attribute that's very similar to the founder of the faith, who was not very popular with church or state in his own time, and sometimes took on those fights. But you see that a little bit with the sourpusses, with we shouldn't seem like we're coming back from funerals. When he says, I love the phrase where he says shepherds should smell of the sheep, which I think is a very vivid way to describe that. But now this is there's nothing more dangerous than a troublemaker with a plan. And this is 220 pages of plan. This previews his papacy. I'll say, as the non-Catholic on the panel, that maybe the most important aspects of this are the things that he says about his church. Okay? There is a very ambitious reform agenda in this document that has to do with prioritization of the message of the church, decentralization of the authority of the church. I think that he understands the basic insight of effective institutional leadership that most people don't get. An institution that sets out to defend itself will often destroy itself. And I'll say this, that the Catholic Church has too often been in that mode from my perspective as a non-Catholic, and he rejects that completely in this approach. He wants an institution oriented towards a great guiding purpose, not towards the defense of its traditions, its institutions, its own institutional integrity. That I think is a huge shift, and we're only beginning to see the beginning of that shift. The content here, however, Francis's amazing revolutionary content is the amazing revolutionary content of the Christian faith and has been in every time, which is a profound personalism, a belief that every individual matters, and that's expressed by our treatment of the most vulnerable in our society. And that is a consistent theme here. No one can be reduced to less than human. No one can be dismissed. No one can be marginalized. It's the thing that transformed the Roman Empire. It's transformed every society. It's what he's calling attention to in his own ministry. He draws both the personal and the public implications of that. Any human system at odds with this principle is criticized. And that's true, including extreme individualism in its capitalist expression. That is the reduction of human beings to the sum of their desires, which actually dulls them to the needs of their neighbors. And it is a very profound restatement of that doctrine. I don't think anyone will find this unfamiliar, but it is really vivid. This is a statement that any society that is content with poverty and hopelessness is not reflecting the values of the faith. And any believer who is content in such a society does not understand their own faith. And that is a pretty extraordinary statement. But let me add just one more thing. And I will the line that really struck me when he talks about this personalism is the need to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. And that is an extraordinary statement about when we encounter other human beings, that we're encountering the sacred in our own lives. And that is, I think that's a wonderful statement. I'll say we don't say this much in Washington, but I'll say it anyway because I don't mind. John and I have been misfits in some very distinguished company. Republicans and Democrats who don't get some of these issues. But I would say that at the heart, that for all of this discussion, the reason that Francis is powerful and attractive to so many is because he talks about Jesus and because he acts like Jesus. And that is the source of power and authority in the Christian church, in all of its expressions. It's what's drawn so many Catholics back to this faith. It's what attracts so many people outside the faith to this Pope. And I would only conclude by saying that a church that looked like this would transform the entire world.
I was really struck by your last point. I set my alarm and woke up so I could watch Francis go to Assisi because I wanted to listen to a talk about poverty, creation, or peace. And I tuned in, and he walked into a room with 100 profoundly handicapped people. And there was no speech. He went from wheelchair to wheelchair to wheelchair, stroking their hand, kissing their forehead. They couldn't talk, but he talked to them.
And we all know the drill. You know, somebody comes in, they say hello to a couple people, they give a speech, and they leave. Well, he visited every single person. And you would think after about 6 of these, I'd go back to bed. It was transfixing. And your point, it looked like Jesus would have acted, and that gives power. Let's turn to Michael's point about individualism. In Washington, we sort of have 2 kinds of individualism. We have kind of the lifestyle individualism, which is alive in some elements of the Democratic Party, which make choice the criteria for everything. And then there's the market individualism, the economic individualism, which places the market as the measure of everything. In Washington, we always want to know, what does this mean for? And so I would ask the 2 of you who give advice to politicians, at least through the newspaper, what is the impact of this, EJ, on Democrats and progressives, and Michael on Republicans and conservatives?
Well, I agree that throughout the document, he comes back again and again to the flaws of individualism. And I wrote in my column this morning today something very much like what you said, that liberals and conservatives alike are fond of certain of their own forms of individualism. But I think that he challenges both sides in interesting ways. I think that when you think about the church's position on abortion, one of the reasons that the church has so much trouble with this is that it doesn't speak of what the act of carrying a child really means. Ernie Cortez, whom you know from the Industrial Areas Foundation, once said that the act of carrying a child and bringing a child into the world is the most generous act a human being ever performs for another human being. Yet when we hear talk about abortion, so much of the language is condemnatory, so much of the language doesn't talk about the role of women, the dignity of women. It doesn't sort of suggest how tragic or difficult this choice can be. And that's why I thought in this document, when he came almost immediately, he put this toward the end of the document, it's worth noting. The social justice stuff was long and up front. This came toward the end of the document. And when he wrote those words that I cited before, that we have not adequately accompanied women in very difficult situations, it strikes me that he is going to get a hearing on this issue in a way that other people would not, because he speaks with respect and compassion in a way others have not. I think for conservatives, there really has been a radicalization on the right. I mean, I told Mike some years ago that I never fully appreciated compassionate conservatives until they practically disappeared. That what you're seeing now is such a deification of the market, to use the Pope's language, that anything that challenges anything that proposes to raise taxes, which is why this trickle-down language was so striking. I never expected a pope ever to condemn trickle-down thinking. He's the first pope who ever told anybody to pay their taxes. That warms the heart of every liberal. But
Paul did that too.
Yes, right. It's been a long time. What I want to say is this whole, his economics has to challenge conservatives. So that I think somebody who is a consistent critic of certain kinds of individualism probably has a better shot at reaching both sides. But he's got a big obstacle on both sides.
So, Mike, on abortion, there's no obsession, no retreat, but no thank you note from NARAL. He restates it in a different context. What does it say? You have been an advocate in your party and in our country for a conservative vision that lifts people up. Where does that stand in light of what the Holy Father's calling?
I'm afraid I agree with EJ that it's really not a view on the rise in the Republican Party. This has been a pretty lean time in my view, and I've written it many times, with the ascendance of libertarian thought and what people call kind of constitutionalist thought, which is a very minimal government approach on these questions. And so it's a real challenge. I would only add, though, that there is another tradition of reflection within the Republican Party. It's not just libertarianism. When I was on Capitol Hill, I don't come from a Catholic background, but was very influenced by Catholic doctrine when it comes to solidarity, meaning that a society is judged by its treatment of the weak and vulnerable, in every case, without exception. And subsidiarity, which is the health of a society is often really determined by the health of its civic institutions and social structures, including the family. This is a very balanced approach to political and social change that sometimes gets more attention than other times. And my confidence here is that those ideas are dormant but not dead. I can give you the reasons for that, but part of it is because libertarianism is a ideology designed for overreach. It is not just opposed to Obamacare. It's opposed to the Great Society, the New Deal, the Square Deal, and the Lincolnian Revolution. Okay, and we'll always reach a point where it goes too far because of the nature of its ideology. And the reality here is that Americans do not want government officials, in my view, that share their contempt for government. They want government officials who no longer justify their contempt. Okay? And that is a big difference. And that's what I think this call to public service in this document is an important statement there. I think there's a political need for these ideas. Eventually, I've participated in 3 presidential campaigns. Eventually, you have to have something to say about the common good. Everyone eventually does. And appeal more broadly, and some people don't know how to talk about it, and some people stumble when they try. But there are elements now, even in this down period, even in this fallow period, you have people like John Kasich in Ohio, or even Mike Lee and some of the people in the Tea Party who understand that there's a necessity to talk about community and strengthening civic institutions and other things. And I would only add that there's this moral element here, this commitment to the common good. And the reality here is that every Christian tradition of reflection on the nature of society has an element of distributive justice. Every single one of them. That's fundamentally at odds with a libertarian vision. And that essentially says some people deserve things just because they're human. They deserve to be treated in a certain way just because of who they are as human beings. And that has a profound reach and importance within many of the constituencies of the Republican Party. And I think a document like this one, like The Joy of the Gospel, will help reinforce that and help build the basis for the next stage.
Kathryn and Bishop Blaire, in a similar way. Bishop Blaire, you were the leader of the Bishops' Conference, elected to speak on these issues. Kathryn, you're an editor at a conservative publication, and you're a leader of a group of Catholic lay people trying to articulate our views in public life. Like I asked Michael and EJ, what is the impact of a document like that on those efforts, on the work of the conference, and on the work of lay people, and if you wish, conservative voices who try to articulate what the church has to offer to public life? Why don't you lead off, Bishop?
Well, I think, first of all, this document is a document on evangelization. It's called The Gospel of Life. And what it seeks to draw out are the gospel values. And gospel values, for example, in response to the question of individualism, all the scriptures are rooted in the covenant of God with the people. And your dignity as an individual is also a part of being a member of a people. So this document seeks to draw out implications of the gospel message. And the whole thrust is that we are to be missionary disciples, that we have a mission. Now, one of the interesting statements that the Pope has is he says, he doesn't say, I'm imitating Christ or I'm following his teaching. He says, I am a mission on earth. I am a mission. Now, if you think about it, when Jesus taught, he wasn't so much teaching the scriptures like the scribes. He wasn't teaching Isaiah the prophet or Deuteronomy. He embraced it, and he was a personal expression of Isaiah, a personal expression of the love of God. And I think that's what Francis here is trying to get across, that we as Christians are to personally see ourselves as expressions of what God wants, that we are a mission. Therefore, we try to take what we are in our mission and apply it to the various experiences of life. And he is quite clear in the document that we can't just talk about principles. The tire does have to hit the road. And he talks about that we have to actually say something about taxes, or something about the common good, or something about the economy. Now, he doesn't think we should be writing the programs, but he certainly thinks we should have a gospel perspective with something specific. I think that's the role of the Bishops' Conference through, say, its domestic policy or international policy, is to seek to apply that gospel message to the real life situation, and not to be afraid to be specific and critical, and yet we don't write the programs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I asked Kathryn to respond. We're going to have some time for questions, and I think there will be a mic in the middle there somewhere. And there's not going to be a lot of time, but if you would get in line. But Kathryn, how would this impact the work you do as somebody who organizes a conversation online, somebody who tries to help lay people articulate our values in the world?
There was, I think it was during the last presidential election, Archbishop Chaput was being interviewed by John Allen, and he said that it was a Catholic News Service interview, but anyway, he said, if you would have asked me a couple of decades ago which party would have become the defender of legal abortion, never in a million years would I thought it would have been the Democrats, because there are Catholics there, and the Catholics wouldn't let that happen. And I think that point is so crucial to everyone involved in politics. If you're Catholic and you are in a party, because we are in both parties, Catholic social teaching is your identity. Catholicism is your identity. It's not your party politics. And that, I think, is the key opportunity at this moment. And so much, a couple of things. First of all, about a lot of my friends on the right who have been commenting in recent days on the Pope. Most of them are relying on what they read in the news, about it. And it's not like, as Mike was saying earlier, it's not like they've been overwhelmed by gospel missionaries, among Catholics and Christians more broadly. So I can't blame them for believing the press accounts and not reading the 4,000 plus words. I think that particularly on issues of poverty, on issues of abortion and marriage, I think it's so true that so much of our public discussion, so much of the rhetoric, even from, frankly, sometimes the most compassionate people I know, we just get into these routines and we get into these sides and we get into talking point modes and things. And one of the things that have been so encouraging about the Catholic Voices Project that I've been working on with Kim Daniels, who's in the audience, and Scott Landry in Boston and some others, is is there are so many people out there in normal walks of life who work, some who are doctors and lawyers and teachers and you name it, lots who work in dioceses across the country who, by the way, do the actual work of the gospel, who are working in maternity homes and are working with youth and working with the poor, and all of the people that the Pope is saying has this tremendous opportunity right now to talk about and tell us to talk about, and give us this platform where we can, like, people actually care about poverty and came out here tonight, we have to take that opportunity now. That's the crucial thing. That's what we've been trying to do with Catholic Voices. But every single Catholic who is on Facebook or can write a letter to the editor or teaches or works in politics, this is our responsibility. And I think if we, to go back to another actually Archbishop Chaput point, which Cardinal Dolan repeated recently, if we don't care about the poor, we're going to hell. I try to think about that every couple of days, because I don't want to go to hell, and what have I done lately?
Well,
that's what we have to think about every day.
Yeah. And I don't know whether I was on a panel is going to cut it in terms of...
No, and I wrote a column isn't going to cut it either, frankly, as much as I'd like to use that.
I wrote a memo. Anybody want to join us here at the mic? You talked about...
Can I make a point?
Sure.
2 points real quick. One is, I appreciate what Kathryn said, but I think many on the right who are reacting to the Pope's words on the economy are correct. They're reading him correctly. They disagree with him. There's a lot of material here that somebody who takes a really hard-line conservative position on economics simply can't agree with. And I think that's the challenge to them. And conservative Catholics have said for a long time that a lot of liberals aren't right with the church on abortion. Well, I think this Pope has put forward some very tough things on economics that I think are genuinely going to cause struggle. And I thought Ross Douthat's column on Sunday was quite clear about that this throws down a real challenge. The only other thing I want to mention, which is, I think, uncontroversial but important, he is the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere. We have to hear this in a different way, or he sees the economy, he sees poverty in a different way because he is from the global South. And the poor folks that he took Cardinal McCarrick to see, he has seen desperate poverty, he has seen economic collapse. And so I think that also adds to the urgency of his economic message.
Cardinal McCarrick said the principles aren't different, but maybe the passion is. And the passion might come from being on the other end of globalization. If you're the Archbishop of Buenos Aires instead of the Archbishop of New York, it probably looks a little different. Here, we have these lights so we can barely see. If you could identify yourself and ask a quick question.
My name is Kurt Asherman. My question is, in light of this document, in light of his pontificate so far, can you be a Pope Francis Catholic and support cutting $15 billion out of the food stamp program?
No is my answer. I'm curious what anybody else says. Thank you for the question. Well, that was easy for me.
Maybe I can let the panel off the hook in that the Bishops' Conference actually has a position on this.
Well, of course, the bishops do have a position on this, that it would be most unjust to cut food stamps that significantly, or to even cut food stamps. I think that Pope Francis would be very upset to hear anybody describe themselves as a Pope Francis Catholic. I think what he wants us to be is a Christian, a follower of Christ, devoted to the gospel. And this is one thing I would not want to leave here without saying this tonight, that the Pope is very insistent that we in the church reform ourselves and that we make the church go out from herself with a mission which is focused on Christ and committed to the poor.
Okay.
Can I just add, though, I don't think, this is why I think context is so important. It's not to leave anybody on the hook, off the hook or to get into the defending budget matters right now. But the context is important. So much of our politics depersonalizes and exploits. There are both of those things going on. If you're actually looking at a person and seeing the face of Christ because you know Christ, the whole way you approach politics is going to be different. And that, I think, is crucial for both sides, and is what can potentially, when people talk about this being a revolutionary moment, if people actually get that, that makes a difference.
Your point about being Catholic first, the context on food stamps, it's not only the cut in food stamps, it's the alternative. They have to cut $40 billion, and they have two choices. They can cut food for hungry family, or they can cut subsidies for relatively rich farmers. And the way politics works is the people with the most money and the most connections often prevail. So the pressure is really on to protect the interests of agribusiness over against the interests of hungry families. And so I think your point, the point up here, we have to change politics. The Pope said we need politicians who hear and feel the cry of the poor and set their sights on education, jobs, and health care for all. I think most of our politicians in Washington are isolated. We've had a whole series in the polls that Washington is now the most affluent place in the country, where the 1% are moving in, and frankly, the poor people are moving out. I live in Prince George's County, and that's where they're moving to. So I think Washington is isolated. I think that affects both parties. I think it affects both branches.
John, that's not fair on food stamps. I'm sorry. You can. I don't like false equivalency in politics.
I thought it was clear on food stamps, but I think the
very
isolation belongs to everybody.
And because I think one of the things that's troublesome on food stamps, you're quite right about agribusiness, and that's where the cut should be, not in food stamps. But there have been a lot of mean things said about food stamp recipients. There are a lot of things said about food stamp recipients, that they're lazy, that they're undeserving, that this is dependency. And that really is, I think, language that sort of flies in the face of everything the church says, let alone just Pope Francis says. And it's marginalizing a group of human beings, and I think it violates the very things that Mike so rightly pointed to in terms of not objectifying others.
Let me add, just by way of a little counterbalance here, that the document talks about the dignity of business as an important category. It criticizes the welfare mentality in the document, which I think is an important point as well. It makes clear that the church, their expertise is not necessarily on the policy matters, the application of these issues, which I think is an important point to be made broadly. In fact, the document says, the church does not have technical solutions to offer and does not claim to interfere in any way with the politics of states. She does, however, have a mission of truth to accomplish in every time and circumstance for a society that is attuned to man, to his dignity, and to his vocation. That, I think, is the balance of this document, which it's generally very successful in doing. But it does mean that politics is oriented towards human dignity, and that's to take hunger seriously as an important category. I would only add, however, that the criticism of trickle down in the document, by the way, is actually defined within the document. So it's not a criticism of Jack Kemp, as far as I can tell. A growth-oriented society. He actually, right? He actually,
well, he's in a place to find out.
Right, exactly. But it actually defines. It goes on to define it as saying that growth is enough or sufficient in a society. That economic growth is enough. That actually points to a very important point. There's a lot of mention of inequality in this document, yes. Which I think is perfectly appropriate. We have, of course, found how complex the issue of inequality is. It's not just a matter of income, or we could solve it tomorrow, okay? It, in fact, is inequality of opportunity, of the family you're brought up in, of the neighborhood, the cohesion of the neighborhood you live in, of the economic opportunity in certain areas of the country, of family structure. These are complex, difficult social and political problems to which there aren't a bunch of very simple answers, and justifies a serious, productive debate between the parties about what best serves human dignity in this. But in that light, the option here, which I think he makes clear, is that it's not an option to have a crude and naive trust in free markets, or what he calls the absolute autonomy of markets. And that's a fairly narrow criticism. It doesn't apply to everyone in the Republican Party. But it
No,
is,
I'm not talking about, I'm just talking about food stamps. He did say a crude and naive trust in those wielding economic power. That's very important. But just to be genuinely fair and balanced, my conservative friends have pointed out to me that the Pope also criticized adolescent progressives. And I only wish I were young enough to be an adolescent progressive.
I just want to say one other thing, because I agree with all of Mike's criticisms of libertarianism. There are some great encouraging things coming out of the Heritage Foundation, and I know it has gotten associated with the shutdown, but Jennifer Marshall and the Domestic Policy Shop actually talk about and think about and talk with poor people and people working in the inner city, have regular meetings about it, are really trying to highlight and uplift people. And I am glad that Mike Lee was mentioned, because do actually listen to him.
Here's the plan. We're going to take one more question. We're going to have one more round, and I'm going to make two announcements. We started about 10 minutes late, and we're going to finish about 10 minutes late. So next question.
Hi, my name is Alexander Martone. I'm a student at the law school here. My question regards, there's been a lot of commentary whenever I hear Pope Francis say something which sounds sort of new and exciting. There's always pushback. No, Pope Benedict said that. Nothing's changed. The media is messing things up again, and Catholic memes post something on Facebook making fun of, NBC News. But, for me, I really do hear new things coming from the Pope. I'm both gay and Catholic, and when the Pope said, that's the famous statement, now who am I to judge, I cried, because here was a leader of the church not talking about someone like me as, a scapegoat for the sex abuse scandal, or someone lurking around corners trying to break up heterosexual marriages, which I promise you we're not trying to do. But someone talking about me as someone trying to seek God and live by the Gospels. And so I don't think that's just a change in messaging. It speaks to me as a change in values as well. So I wonder if you could discuss why there is this push to say everything is just, nothing is actually different. It's the media, tripping over new messaging.
Yeah.
Could I say basically amen to that? Because I don't think Pope Francis would be inspiring the broad excitement he's inspiring if he weren't speaking to people like you and lots of people just like you around the church. I think his main mission, in fact, may be to former Catholics, who are, I believe, the third largest denomination in the United States of America. And that I think that people are hearing, in some sense, the old Christian message. I mean, the Christian message goes back to 2,000 years. On these economic questions, the earlier popes have been critical of the unregulated market. But again, they hear an urgency here that they didn't hear before. And just to quote Pope Francis, he said, we cannot insist, in the America interview, we cannot insist only on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods. This is not possible. And when he said, who am I to judge? Many of us thought, isn't that what a pope does for a living? I mean, that was really a stunning thing to hear the Holy Father say. And so I think there is genuinely something new, and that's why a lot of people are here tonight.
Stephen Colbert was quoted as, on the who am I to judge, he said, you're the Pope. And then his other comment was, thank God Jesus didn't live to see this.
God bless Stephen
Blaire. As a communications matter, I think part of what he's communicating in the America interview, in the comments that are taking people, are surprising people for various reasons. He's saying to people, and I understand the instinct because I may have been one of the people who, I'm, believe it or not, too old for memes, but I may have, quoted Pope Benedict and others previously, because there are similar messages, but I totally see people are hearing it all differently, and where doors were closing, doors are now opening, and in things like the American media, the America interview and the plane interview, he's saying to us. I mean, sometimes people. I think some of the initial reactions from some were, but wait a second. I am helping women. I work in a maternity home. These kind of things. But if the world doesn't know that, and a desperate mother doesn't know she can actually go somewhere, well, then we're missing something here, and I think that is what is key and revolutionary, if you will, at least from a communications point of view, and what we've got to run and take this opportunity and help open more doors.
Okay. Two things. Previews of coming attractions. We are not going to spend every dialogue on the Pope, although fascinating as that is. One of the things that we want to do in the future is on the moral perils of partisanship. What are the obligations? What are the limitations of partisans in political life? And if people have good ideas about how to structure that conversation, we'd like to talk to you. The one thing we are going to do is on February 3rd, which is our next dialogue, we're going to look back at this year, the resignation of a pope, the election of a pope, and the struggles that we've talked about tonight, and look forward to what it means. And we're still working on that, but I can report that John Allen, who works for National Catholic Reporter and CNN, will be a part of that discussion. So put down February 3rd. I think it'll be a very interesting evening and help us think about how we could have a really good discussion about the moral dimensions of partisanship. The other thing we're doing, and I'm going to turn this into the last question for our panelists, we believe that Catholic social thought provides a way on really important issues to bridge some of the ideological and partisan divisions. We've chosen poverty, tonight's topic, to be that. And we are working with evangelicals and Catholic leaders to try and put together a gathering, a process that would do two things. One would confront the silence on poverty, and that's what I was referring to, not the food stamp fight, that is too pervasive in our society. No one is really talking about it, including very often some of us. Secondly, to deal with the stalemate, where one set of actors talk about the importance of family life, don't have a baby before you're married, graduate from high school, it's important to have a job in the family in order to avoid that. And another group talk about economic issues. You gotta have jobs, you gotta have wages, you gotta have health care. When everything we know, if you are poor or if you work with the poor, is it's both those things that have to work together to lift people out of poverty. What advice, given what the Holy Father has said, what advice would you have for us working with Catholics and evangelicals to try and create a voice, a pressure, a conversation about how we would overcome the silence and break the stalemate so that in the next presidential election, in the next Congress, there would be a real debate about poverty and how to overcome it. What advice? How do you bridge some of these divides? How do you break the silence? And let's begin with EJ and work this way.
Well, I think you need to go on a 40-day fast and retreat if you ever expect to change all of this. I mean, I think right now it is very difficult because there is this pulling apart. And as I say, I would insist particularly on a certain radicalization on the right. However, I do think that the family issue, I think there are three issues where there is opportunity. One is the family issue, because if you're a liberal who cares about inequality, you have to care about family breakdown and the costs of that. If you are a conservative who cares about the family, you have to care about economic difficulties, inequality, and the way in which that is helping to break up families. And I see little movements among some social thinkers. There's a great piece in Democracy Magazine in which I have an interest called The Parenting Gap, which were basically a group of relatively liberal scholars talking about how family, how greater family stability and more parental engagement and the like could be help deal with inequality. But again, you have to deal with the cost of the economy. Second is incarceration. This is one I am really excited about, where there's a group of conservatives called Right on Crime, and if you don't want government to spend a lot of money, one of the things you don't want them to spend it on is building more jails. And I think some of it, for some of them, really does come from a Christian conviction that we've gone too far with retributive justice, and haven't gone far enough with restorative justice. And so I think changing sentencing is particularly on victimless crimes. I think there's a real opportunity there. And the third, and you're already seeing it realized, is on the death penalty. And there are a lot of people, I have really been moved by people in the Right to Life movement, some of whom had supported the death penalty, who have moved to opposition precisely because they want their witness on the issue to be consistent. And because of the falling crime rates, I think Americans feel easier about ending the death penalty. So support for the death penalty has dropped in less than 20 years from 80% of Americans to 60%. That's a big drop. I think all of these areas, family's going to be vexed, but I think family, incarceration, the death penalty really could create alliances across lines, and I think Catholics are particularly well suited in each case to help bring about that alliance.
Michael.
Well, first I'd say I join the discussion on all three of those issues. I think those are promising areas where you could have a serious discussion. I'd add two of my own. One of them, which the document deals with, are issues of global poverty and suffering and health. This is an area where in the last 10 years, not many people know about it, but we've had one of the most hopeful things happen in American politics over the last 10 years has been this extraordinary bipartisan, cross-ideological alliance to do things on AIDS and malaria and other issues in American life. This is the way politics should work. Millions of people have benefited around the world. The cause of social justice has been served. The cause of the American interest in the world, our standing in the world, has been served. It's been a tremendous win-win that doesn't get enough attention and could be the model for a lot of other types of engagement. I think, secondly, that they're getting beyond some of this more sterile economic debates just in the American political context. Instead of just talking about absolute income inequality or talking about economic freedom as the only goal, a greater emphasis on mobility in our society would be a very important value. In fact, the document itself talks about investment in efforts to help the slow, the weak, the less talented to find opportunities in life. Okay? And right now we have a mobility crisis in America, by which many people who are born into poverty will remain in poverty, and their children are likely to remain in poverty, fundamentally at odds with the American ideal of opportunity and advancement over time. And that should be a shared value. Building those social conditions, the social capital that is necessary for people to succeed in a free economy, to have the skills, the background, the family structures that are necessary. Robert Putnam, who I depend on a lot of these issues, has called this a perfectly purple problem. Basically because A lot of this is rooted in values and family structure, and a lot of it is rooted in declining post-industrial kind of communities where you have serious economic challenges, and if you don't address both, you can't address it. So that would be another area, I think.
Just parentheses. I'm happy to report that Robert Putnam is among the people who is thrown in with us and is going to be very much a part of this process. Kathryn?
Well, first of all, I'll join EJ on the let's do a 30-day Ignatian retreat, maybe in the spirit of Jesuit University.
I'm not
Jesuit
going
Pope.
for that fasting bit.
I think again, the advice would be follow the Pope's lead here. So many of these debates are depersonalized, right? And when we're just talking about abstract ideas, and we're not talking about people and their stories and what actually works for them, then we have the comfort and we're able, the luxury to be able to talk in these abstract terms and not get anywhere. And so using some of those examples that Mike and EJ brought up and telling people, making us look at people's faces, I think is just crucial. And I think too, frequently when Catholics and when the Bishops' Conference it winds up inserted in a political debate, whether they took the lead or they were brought into a news story for issues for purposes of convenience or legitimate ones, people don't see it outside their ideological lens, right? In our news cycle lens, they don't get where the credibility is coming from, where the authority is coming from. We don't do a good enough job about talking, the church, Catholics, about the social services that are provided, and not just as a mere political debate, but the actual lives. And so when Cardinal Dolan or whomever it is talking about immigration, they're just hearing, so many people are processing it as, he doesn't agree with me today, or, he's just being liberal on this, or whatever it is. But the church is actually speaking from experience and authority, and if we see it in that lens rather than the impoverished political lens we often look at things, I think that changes it, and it has to do with, I think it just goes back to, again, everything that Pope Francis is modeling. If we're actually living Christian lives, then we actually have something to bring to the table. We're not just people talking.
Bishop Blaire?
Well, what I would say in addition to that is that Pope Francis brings out very clearly that the bishops and the clergy are only a very small part of the church. And what he's talking about in this document is the whole church, all the people, that the church, meaning everyone, must be engaged in this great missionary adventure which is committed to the poor. And he makes a suggestion in there how we could proceed. He puts a great emphasis on process, and he says, first of all, that we as a church should discern how we are to be a church in the light of the gospel, how we are to fulfill our commitment to the poor. And so we need to, I think we have to look to ourselves first in the church, and I think we have to discern how to be faithful to the gospel. Then he says, once we discern that, we need to purify ourselves. And I think that's very important because the reality is we have a lot of Catholics in government. We have a lot of Catholics in professions. We have a lot of Catholics. Have they reflected on the light of the gospel in terms of their role? And how do we purify ourselves so that we are more legitimate in addressing the issues? Of course, there can be various political perspectives, but we first of all have to purify ourselves in terms of, are we being faithful to the gospel? So the first question I think we have to ask, for example, in regards to food stamps is, are we helping or hurting the poor? Very simple, basic question. And then Pope Francis says the third step is after we discern and purify ourselves, then we have to reform ourselves so that we are really bringing the gospel, being a leaven. He talks about that the church needs to be a leaven in society. And so I think we have to look to ourselves first, and part of looking to ourselves is also working together with other Christians, with people of different interfaith, with Jews, Muslims, and people of goodwill. And the Pope puts a great emphasis on dialogue. And I go back to Pope Paul VI and his great document on the church. And so that in all of these issues, we have to sit down and dialogue in order to move forward. And the Pope accepts the fact it's messy and complicated, but we have to do it.
Well, we've had an example of dialogue tonight. A little messy, pretty complicated. I found many of the things very reassuring. I found one thing deeply disconcerting, and it was something Cardinal McCarrick said. And it was the line from the document that said, no one has an excuse for turning away from these matters, especially academics, professionals, and even those in ecclesiastical circles. Well, I've spent most of my life in ecclesiastical circles. I'm now in academic life, and I feel like I've been targeted.
You're on the hook.
And I haven't felt this bad since the Pope said we can't be couch potatoes. I think the message here is one of clarity. The measure of a society is how we treat the least of these, and all of us have an obligation to be a part of those choices, those decisions, and those relationships. And it is just amazing to me to turn on the Sunday morning talk shows and hear the debate about income inequality in America. And it wasn't the Census Bureau that made that happen. It was an apostolic exhortation from the Roman Catholic Church. Join me in thanking our panel.